Thank you for sticking with me through this sewing tutorial project sort of a thing. If you've not seen the previous episodes on this, pop into the playlist or into the description. There'll be links to the other videos in there so you can get caught up on where we are with the shirt. Now we've already done the body and we've got the sleeves put on. I've found some buttons that I like. I'll show you those in a moment. So today I'm going to do the collar, which are these pieces here, and we're going to put the cuffs onto the sleeves themselves. Funny thing with buttons and trims is you have an idea in your head of what you want, and then when you go through what you've got, you change your mind. These buttons I found in the wrong place. They hadn't been organised and put away. I've been organising some other things, and they're salvaged from another shirt I had years ago. So I've got just the right amount to do this shirt, which is always a bit of a bonus. They're just plastic, they are imitation bone, and I thought they might look a bit, I don't know, cheap. And then I put them on the shirt and suddenly they just made sense. They pull out all the colours in the print here, they have some of the colours of the off-white of the main body of the shirt. I have the right amount, they're a good size. It just made sense. When you put the cuffs together, they're in 3 layers. You have an outer layer, an interfacing layer, and an inner layer. Because of limitations with the printed fabric, I can only do one of the outer layers in that, and then the other is in the fabric of the main body. The other alteration that I've made here is I've made the cuffs an inch narrower than they would be normally, just because I've got slightly smaller wrists. I found when I did these with the standard width for the pattern, the cuffs just kind of went down over my hands, which isn't a look I'm after. When you sew these together, you've got to pay attention to the order of the pieces. So you can't sew it like this, because if you do, your interfacing layer will end up on the outside. If you've used an iron-on interfacing, that's not an issue, because that's going to be inside anyway. So what you need to do is your first layer is the interfacing, which is the calico I'm using. Your second layer is your outer fabric. If you've got a sided fabric, like I have with the print here, make sure that your print is facing up on this layer and down on this layer. And then we'll sew around the outside edge of the cuff on 3 sides. Leave one long side open. You'll need that open for the next stage. With your 3 seams done, the next thing is to trim this down, because then when you turn it the right way out, that's going to make life a lot easier. Another thing I'll mention, because I learned this as I was doing it, if you have a directional print, and I do, some of these flowers go up a certain way, you need to pay attention to which way round you're sewing the long seam on. In my case, the bottom is the bottom of the print, so this is that part of your cuff, and then this seam here is the bit up here that joins onto your sleeve. I know I'm wearing a jumper, that's not really good for demonstration purposes. So do pay attention to that. I did get it wrong, so I had to unpick this and redo it. Never mind. So this is what you end up with when it comes off the machine. You've got your 3 nice even lines on the edges. And the first thing you do is cut the corners. And you don't want to go too close to your stitches, but you want to put a little angle on there, and that will just make it so that your corners turn out a bit nicer. And you want to bring the seam allowance down by about half. Again, this will just give a nicer finish on the cuff. Providing you've got all the layers the right way around, you can then turn it all out. And using any sort of pokey implement, a pencil, or as I'm using here, a pair of scissors, knitting needle, crochet hook, teaspoon handle, whatever works, just carefully poke your corner out until you've got all your fabric as much as you can to a point. Just take your time, you don't need to force it. If you work sort of from this side towards the point and go from both sides, you'll find the point will pretty much turn itself out. And just don't push too hard when you get to the point here. You don't want to jab the tool out through your fabric. We're back from the ironing board. I've got both cuffs pressed here and laid out together. One thing to be aware of on your long edge is sometimes the middle of it doesn't quite turn out as far as your corners. So just make sure that you've pushed all of this out properly so that you can get a nice sharp edge when you press it. Otherwise it can sort of curve a little bit there, which you don't want. Some fabrics are more prone to it than others. This one seems to be fairly prone to it. But with it being cotton, once you've pressed it, it holds its shape really nicely. Before you sew these onto the shirt, I would strongly suggest laying one cuff on top of the other and checking your raw edges up here. Because sometimes the fabric can stretch and shift as you sew it together and press it, and you can end up with a wonky edge or one cuff being slightly longer than the other one. So if you trim this square, your cuffs will be even when they're sewn on. Fortunately for me, everything lined up pretty good and I didn't really need to do any trimming, which is nice. You can see as well the pattern on each cuff is slightly different, but that's okay, it still matches the shirt. And it is directional, so this is the edge that goes onto the sleeve. So as I mentioned before, if you have a directional print, do take care that you got it the right way around. We're going to sew one side of the cuff onto the shirt. So you don't want to sew both sides together, you just want to sew one half, and then your other side you need to not sew onto the sleeve. You'll find if you've used a separate interfacing that there'll be a way that everything wants to naturally go, depending on how you've pressed it. And for me, the outer fabric with the print on wanted to be separate to the inner fabric and the interfacing. So I'm just working with the single outer layer of the cuff and the layer of the sleeve here. The pattern calls for pleats on the sleeve. You can use gathers instead if you prefer, but with this being a heavier fabric, the pleats are going to look correct. The pattern also says 3, I'm doing 4. Again, this is just down to the nature of the fabric. Some fabrics you will do less, some you will do more. As long as your pleat number on the left and the right sleeve match, and as long as they're about the right size and in the same place, whatever you do will be fine. You do want to match both sides, if at all possible. And you can see with the ones I've done, this isn't pressed, this is just how they are pinned. It puts your little gathers in like that. When you're figuring out which side to do it, where the split is in the sleeve, you have a short side, which is from here to the seam that you've done, and then you have a long side, which is the other side. Obviously your pleats want to go in the long side. On the sleeve there is a little guide notch triangle here. You may still have it on your cuff as well, depending on how you've done your cuffs. I didn't, but this is a good marker. This is where your pleats start, so you want to pin from the edge to that notch flat and then start your pleats. And I've got one left to do. You can see how much too much fabric there is there. So this is the cuff here, and then this is the sleeve, and we need to get all that fabric to disappear. So what I do is I put my finger in there. You can see the fabric already wants to go like that, and I smooth the rest down until everything meets up. I've got my existing pleat here, and what I want to do is make it so that this part of the pleat meets the fold of this. So if I just pinch that there, this fold meets up with where I've pinched it, and all the rest of the fabric is flattened out. pin it in place. And everything is ready to sew. You will find there's a little bit of trial and error for you, but if you pin each end of where you're going to sew and just sort of shuffle your excess around a bit, you'll get to a point where it feels like it fits properly. And that's roughly how it will look. It's quite an easy one to do, really, that. And they're all ready for pressing. When it comes to doing the cuff on the inside, there's two approaches you can take. I've pressed the seam, so this is nice and smooth here where the seam is, and then I've folded and pressed the inside of the cuff. You can either pin all this down and just top stitch along with the machine. So instead I'm opting to hand sew. I'm using the nearest match I've got to the colour I've got, which isn't too obvious on camera, but bear in mind this is inside the sleeve, so the only person who will ever really see it is you. And the trick is to pick up some of the threads on the back of your fabric, but don't go all the way through. The section that I've done here, you can't actually see any of the stitches coming through from the other side. This is a bit easier with a heavier fabric like this as well. If you're using a normal shirt weight fabric, it's quite difficult to actually pick up the threads. You just pick up a couple and then go through the edge of the cuff fold that you've pressed, and it's just a simple whip stitch. And you just do that all the way along the seam until you've done the whole cuff. It doesn't take very long. You can use the stitch line that you've done for sewing the outer cuff on as your guide here as well. You want to be just covering that with the fold of the inner cuff. That one's a slightly ugly stitch, but never mind. You are allowed to do that. You're the one setting the rules here, so whatever standard you decide to do this to is your standard, nobody else's, and nobody can judge you on your sewing standards. Your next shirt will be better than this shirt, and the next one will be better than that. And as long as you're happy with the end result when you make it, that's all that matters. Sewing is one of those creative journeys where you're never finished. You're always learning, you're always improving. And that's very important to remember as you work. It can be very easy to get caught up in what you regard as perfect projects and people who look like it's easy for them. And I can guarantee you, even the very talented people out there who've been doing this for years, know exactly what they're doing, even they have off days, even they have projects that they just throw together. And that's good. Nobody needs to be 100% of the time. Thread I'm using here is from Gutman. It's a slightly heavier weight thread, which I like for these kind of jobs, and I like using this one for sewing buttonholes and buttons on. This is probably what I'll use for the buttonholes on this shirt because it's the nearest match I've got. worth spending a little bit more if you can on things like your threads, because they just last a bit longer. If you go with the very, very cheap threads, sometimes you'll find that you're re-sewing things repeatedly. Nobody wants that. So if you can spend just a tiny bit more, get some slightly nicer materials, it does last a bit better. Right, and as we come to the end, this is the other reason I like doing it by hand rather than machine. There's quite a lot of fabric thickness change as you get to this part of the cuff at the end, and the machine can struggle a little bit with it sometimes because obviously the machine likes everything to be the same thickness, so the tension can be kept even all the way along. I find that if I hand stitch it, I can get just a slightly nicer finish on the end. So as we finish off this edge, I'm going to go through the 2 layers as I have been, and then go back through the loop of your thread, and that just helps make a little knot to tie everything off. That's very, very flat, it's not a bulky knot, and it's very easy to do, so you're using the thread's own tension to keep everything together nicely. Do that, 2, 3, 4 times, you don't have to go crazy. And then the last thing to do is push your needle inside the cuff and bring it out at any point, and then snip off your thread. So you can just see where it's popped through just there, it's just disappeared, and then just pull your cuff apart a little bit. That hides the tail end of your sewing and just keeps it safe and makes sure that all of this cuff is nice and secure. When you start at the other end, you just tie on as normal through your fabric with a couple of knots like we've just used, and then just sew along, and that's fine for that end. And there you have it, one cuff sewn on. I need to correct a little bit of information here. The trouble with sewing is you can't really go back and do it again once you've done it. And this is one of those situations. Now you remember, as we were putting the cuffs together, I mentioned that you can, by modifying the pattern slightly, make French cuffs. What I did by accident is I modified the pattern slightly and made French cuffs. Let me show you what happened. On the mannequin here is my test run shirt. This was the first one I did with the pattern, just to make sure that I was happy with the fit and everything else. I knew it was going to be close. I had this fabric to use, so that's what I did. But I didn't record this, so there isn't a video. Never mind. The thing about these cuffs is I was a little bit, I don't know, this just seemed very big compared to the last time I did it. I thought, you know what, be sensible. Get your shirt out that you've already done. And yeah, do you know what? The new cuff is about twice the depth. And on this cuff, there isn't a seam here, it's folded. So I made a mistake. And the mistake I made is when I cut this piece out, that's the whole cuff. This side of it normally, and it folds, and then you sew it inside. I'm going to show you how to do this properly in just a moment. What I've done is I've cut 2 outers and 2 inners because in my brain for some reason I thought that was the way to do it without looking at the pattern. So always look at your instructions. Learn from my mistakes so you don't make it. However, you now know how to make French cuffs, because all you do with these, put a buttonhole here and here, and then you fold the cuff back and you have a French cuff that your cuff link of choice goes through, and you put the 2 buttonholes on each side. So it's just the same as I've done here. You can't really see them, but little buttonhole there and another one just there. I've cut out some sample fabric. I will show you how to do these cuffs properly now that I've shown you how to do French cuffs as a little bonus, I suppose. Here we are on the sewing desk. I've made a miniature sample to show you how the cuffs go together. This isn't to scale. This piece here represents the sleeve, so you'll have to pretend it's got the pleats in and the little bound edge on the slit like we showed you before. This piece here is the cuff. Now, where I showed you to cut 2 pieces of fabric out for the cuff, you actually only need 1 of those because that's your entire cuff. If you're using an iron-on interface, you want it to be slightly less than half the full length of the cuff. If you're using a separate piece, as I am with the calico, again, just make sure it's slightly less than half the size of the cuff. This matters when you actually fold all of your seams together. The first thing we'll do is, with your interfacing to the outside, you want to fold the cuff in half and then sew down these edges. With that done, turn your cuff the right way out. Now normally I would press this to flatten everything out. Because I'm just doing a demonstration here, I'm not going to do that. If you prefer, you can cut the corners off diagonally of the cuffs. If your fabric is lightweight enough, as this is, you can just push the corners out and that gives you your cuff piece. The next job is to attach the sleeve to the interface side of the cuff. And you just want to sew straight along and leave the non-interfaced side of the cuff unattached at this point. So now your sleeve and your cuff are both attached to one another on one side. We have to deal with the back, and the way to do that is you fold your raw edges inside the cuff, and then the side of the cuff you haven't sewn, fold and press. So we'll pretend I've pressed it because, well, this is just a quick addendum here. And now you have 2 options. You can either hand sew this seam here, and you want the folded edge to meet up with your stitch line so that you're hiding that, or you can top stitch along it. If you're doing a top stitch, I would recommend doing it on the side that's visible, because that way the most visible side is the tidiest. I'm going to top stitch this one because I think that will be quicker and easier for this demonstration, and probably more likely what you're going to do. Lots of people don't like hand sewing. When you're doing the real deal, just take your time a little bit with this. You want it as tidy as you can make it. And that is a finished cuff. No raw edges. Because this is the top stitch version, you do see the top stitch, and it is a little bit stiffer when you do it this way. It all depends on personal preference and what sort of finish that you want. And you then of course put a buttonhole, or maybe 2 if you want cufflinks, and a button of your choice so that you can just do up the cuff.